Okay, it's working. So it's me again. Thank you so much to the Keynes Fund for letting me present today. So I'm new at Cambridge and I'm presenting you a paper that's called On the Origin and Persistence of Identity-Driven Choice Behavior. So just to be clear, what I mean with identity-driven choice behavior is simply the phenomenon that we see that a priori identical individuals belonging to different social groups, they tend to make different career or educational choices. For example, in France, they showed that socially less advantaged high school children are less likely to choose the top educational pathways than equally performing, but simply socially more advantaged peers. And there are many other examples. And so this phenomenon, it contributes to inequality across social groups, and it also negatively affects the diversity among individuals pursuing a certain career. And so these issues, they've received significant attention in especially in recent years. And policies that aim to attack these issues have also been extensively studied, like affirmative action policy or role model policies. Now, if we want to optimally design these policies, we have to know how and why social context affects individual decision-making. And this has spiked a very large literature in the social sciences in general. And I'm just going to give you some examples. This is not at all a complete overview. So for example, when people anticipate discrimination in a certain environment, then they tend to invest less in pursuing opportunities in this environment, or they may even avoid the environment altogether. There are also social norms that prescribe behavior for people with certain identities that is considered normal or expected. And these social norms, they guide choice behavior either because they are socially enforced or because they are internalized. And then thirdly, it is costly for us to interact with people that are different from us. And this creates in-group favoritism and also homogeneous social networks that affect people's opportunities in, but also knowledge of domains in which their social group is relatively underrepresented. And then finally, there's stereotypes about what type of person is good at what type of task. And these stereotypes, and specifically the social context that they are derived from, they do not only influence the way in which we evaluate others, but they also influence the way in which we evaluate ourselves. And now when there's a true correlation between a certain ability and a social identity, then social context provides useful information for people to learn about their own value of a certain ability. And so then you have the literature on social learning that explains how we can actually learn from the outcomes of others. But then recent literature also shows that the social context affects the way in which people form beliefs about their own abilities when no such correlation exists. And so in this paper, I developed a theory that tries to explain why we could observe this behavior. And so the main question I ask is, how does irrelevant data about who is currently successful at what type of task in a society influence the beliefs that people form about their own abilities, and consequently, how does it drive the choices they make? So just to be clear, what I mean with social context in this paper is simply information about what social groups are relatively more successful at what type of tasks. So then I analyze how social context influences the way in which people evaluate their own abilities. And specifically, I want to make sense of why does this social context, when it is irrelevant, affect the beliefs that people form. I then analyze how it affects their choice behavior in order to see whether at the aggregate level that this mechanism can induce persistent identity-driven choice behavior. So because I don't have much time, let me just give you a description of the model. So I analyze a society with a very large number of agents, and each individual is described by an ability type and an observable characteristic. So let's say that this ability type is someone's math ability, and let's say that the observable characteristic is someone's gender. Then I assume that gender and math ability, they are independently distributed. And then people have to choose between an ability-related task, of which the probability of success depends on their individual specific ability, or an outside option that has a similar probability of success for everyone. So for example, let's say that individuals have to choose between two options in order to win a prize. In the first option, they first have to complete a math-related task, and if they do so successfully, they get the prize. In the second option, they just enter in a lottery and they get the prize with a fixed probability. So then those that are very good at math, they should choose to undertake the math-related task because they have a higher probability of getting the prize. And while if you're not so good at math, you better enter the lottery. So I assume that people have a general idea of what their math ability is, but that this perception is noisy. Sometimes they're a bit too overconfident because they have a very good day. And sometimes people might be a bit too underconfident because they just received really bad feedback, for example. And so this noisiness creates two possible mistakes that people can make. And so the key thing to take away here is that this over and underconfidence has an asymmetric effect on decision-making depending on the true ability type. So for example, if we have someone that's really good at math and this person is overconfident, then this doesn't hurt this person's decision-making because he or she will still choose to undertake the math-related task. While when this person is underconfident, this might actually induce this person to make the mistake of entering the lottery. And this is exactly vice versa for someone that is not very good at math. If this person is too underconfident, it doesn't hurt decision-making. But when this person is too overconfident, then this can possibly induce this person to undertake the math-related task, while this person shouldn't have done that. So then people also observe around them a sample of people that have already made a similar choice at some earlier point in time. And they can observe their gender, let's say, to stick to the example. And so again, remember that this information is irrelevant because there are no ability differences in math between men and women. But yet I'm going to give people the option to use this information regarding others to bias their own perception in a direction contingent on their social group. So there are different statistics that people can focus on, and I will get back to this later, but let's for the time being just say that people can observe how many women or men there are among all successful people that won the prize in the math task. Now, if I'm a woman and I see that women are very much underrepresented, then I can use this information to make myself believe, okay, so probably I'm also not going to be very likely to be successful. So in other words, it leads to a pessimistic interpretation of my own perception. While for men, when they see that men are relatively overrepresented, they can use this information to have an optimistic interpretation of their own perception. And so now the story behind this is that people have a natural tendency to look at others like them when they are not sure what to do. And this is backed up by research in psychology. And now the thing is that this tendency can actually sometimes help people to improve decision-making, even when this information is irrelevant, but it might also hurt people's decision-making. And I'm going to assume that people make similar or multiple similar choices throughout their lifetime, and that they can actually learn from their own experience whether they should repress this natural tendency or not. So for example, again, we have a man that is very good at math. He observes that men are relatively overrepresented. So when he takes this into account, this actually increases the likelihood that he will end up choosing the math-related task, which is his optimal choice. When on days that he's too overconfident, it doesn't really affect his decision-making. But on days that he's a bit underconfident, the fact that he sees that many other men have been successful might actually protect him from making this mistake of choosing the lottery instead of the math-related task. So it actually helps him, and he will learn from experience not to repress this natural tendency. But if you take a woman that is also very good at math, she observes that women are relatively underrepresented. And so this would only enhance the adverse effects of her being too underconfident on certain days. So she will learn from experience to repress this natural tendency. And this is basically the main result, that if the social information biases perception towards the optimal choice, individuals learn to not repress it, while when it biases information, it biases perception away from the optimal choice, people learn to repress it. And so this shows that irrelevant information can actually help people to improve decision-making on average when their perceptions are noisy to start with. Now then, social context influence the beliefs, but beliefs, they influence choices, and choices, they again lead to outcomes that lead to a new social context. So we have a dynamic system here. So again, the direction of the bias that the information induces can be asymmetric across groups. Men can only bias their own perception upwards, women could only bias it downwards. And so people belonging to different social groups, they end up comparing different belief formation heuristics. And so they can each potentially correct for a different type of mistake. And at the aggregate level, this induces asymmetries in choice behavior across a priori identical individuals belonging to different social groups, in the sense that we have a population effect where people from the socially more successful group are more likely to undertake the task. So we will observe that there will be more men undertaking the math task than women. But there's also a selection effect in the sense that, conditional on choosing this math task, women will have on average a higher success rate. Now, I can show that these population and selection effects, they will actually never reverse the order in social context. So this information always becomes self-confirming, and under certain conditions, it even becomes a self-reinforcing mechanism, in the sense that there exists a population equilibrium in which a priori identical people belonging to different subgroups end up choosing different tasks. So just to go over the main contribution, so I provide a novel explanation for the origin and persistence of this behavior, and it differs from the current literature in the sense that social context is, first of all, not relevant in a Bayesian sense. It doesn't directly affect utility and preferences, and the results are not driven by any type of strategic interaction among agents. And then secondly, I also provide a new methodological angle to analyze subjective beliefs. I depart from the standard Bayesian methodology, and I actually believe subjective beliefs in my model, they are more driven by, they're not so much driven by an attempt to get closer to the truth, but they are driven by a fitness criterion that, ensures that people tend to make, on average, better decisions. And so then there are also some insights for policy. And with that, I come back to the fact that people can actually process and observe different statistics from the information that's out there. And I can actually show that the persistence of the behavior is sometimes eliminated when people, for example, process the statistic of looking at all women that have been successful among all women that tried. And this gives, so this shows that it's actually the perception that people have of the social context that matters for this behavior, and not so much the real social context. And that shows that people can be nudged towards desirable behavior by actually influencing the statistics that people take into account and the information that they have access to, and would imply that informational policies could complement policies that try to obtain real changes in social contexts, like affirmative action policy. So that was it. Thank you very much for your attention.
I'm sorry I have to do this over the screen. Caroline, thank you very much for this really interesting presentation. There are a lot of ways of seeing what's happening in this paper. To me, it first of all is a paper that raises questions about underconfident beliefs and its consequences, which is both a very important question and is understudied. I have two questions to ask. So I'm not a theorist, so I apologize in advance if I got something wrong. I did take a little peek at the paper. To ask my questions, I'm going to use an example of women in STEM, which is which closely follows some of the assumptions of the model. So if you look at university enrollment in STEM subjects, there are typically a lot more men than women. Let's call this fact statistic 1. But if you take, say, Cambridge data on success rates of getting admitted to STEM subjects, then you will see that actually they're very similar across genders. That's called the statistic 2, the comparison of the success rates. So let's say Wei Long, for example, is assessing his chances of getting into a STEM subject at university. Only statistic 2 contains some information for him, not statistic 1. Instead, in Caroline's model, agents make a mistake and confuse the two things. They don't pay attention to statistic 2, which is the really important thing. And they instead focus on statistic 1, just the sheer number of women versus men, conditional on acceptance, which is irrelevant to them. So my understanding, and Caroline, please correct me if I'm wrong, is that the nature of this mistake is very important for some of the results in the paper, particularly for the vicious circle that where we have persistent low numbers of women applying to STEM. So my first question is, do we have empirical evidence that people can confuse these two things, this sort of success rates, statistic 2 with statistic 1, sheer proportions based on conditional on acceptance? It seems very plausible that they might confuse these two things to me, but I think it would be interesting to see empirical evidence. My second question is, if I understand it correctly, what happens in the model is that, again, using our STEM example, underconfident men get a boost to their perceived chances of success by looking at the irrelevant but superficially optimistic statistic that there are more men in STEM than women. And this increases men's applications. Conversely, overconfident women reduce their overconfidence because they see the pessimistic statistic that there are few women in STEM, even though the statistic is irrelevant. Now, empirical evidence, growing empirical evidence on overconfidence shows that actually it is very hard to reduce overconfidence of people with data, even when these data are very, very much relevant and easy to process. So I'm a little bit skeptical about how plausible it is that overconfident people actually take this pessimistic views on board, to this pessimistic signals on board. But I think what I would be more interested to hear about from Caroline is, what is the evidence on underconfidence and how underconfidence reacts to different types of information? How do people adjust overconfidence? And if there isn't much evidence on this, it seems to me that this is a very important area for future research. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julia, for that. So, Caroline, if you want to give some answers to those.
Okay, so thank you, Julia, for this really nice question. So I think that your STEM example is a very nice one. Actually, the model does not necessarily assume that people make the mistake that you mentioned in the first place between the statistic 1 and statistic 2. As a matter of fact, the model is more like a thought experiment. Let's say that people have access to this type of statistic. What can they do with it? And so you are completely right that when people take into account this second statistic, so when they actually see the average within group success rates, that the persistence of the phenomenon, it completely disappears. So that is exactly the policy implication that I was referring to earlier. Now, I do think that these within group success rates, they're often not available to people or much harder to retrieve. So I think it's also in one way a nudge to make this data more available. But on the other hand, there's also something else going on, and I didn't have time to talk about this, but if we assume, and that is a strong assumption to make, but if we find some evidence that actually people are very good at learning whether they should repress or not repress this tendency, then actually this regime in which different groups end up making different choices is Pareto optimal, because people actually use then these statistics only to improve their own decision making, which is really good for everyone. So to get back to your second question about overconfidence and underconfidence, I assume it's a little bit confusing, but I think there are two different things here in the literature. So I think there's a literature on under and overconfidence that talks more about persistent over or underconfidence, and that is not really what I'm aiming at in this paper. So in this paper, I'm saying, let's say that there's some, let's say, point estimate that people have, but there are some day-to-day factors that make the perceptions that people have from day-to-day fluctuate a little bit around this point estimate. So it's a little bit, you could also say people are sometimes a bit optimistic, sometimes they're a bit pessimistic. So that's more what I'm aiming at. So I didn't know about this this evidence that you said about that underconfidence is very hard, or what did you say? Overconfidence is very hard to correct. It'd be really nice to see that paper. But so in this specific, I think in this specific context, it works a little bit different, because I do not assume to start off with that people are systematically or over or under confidence. So did I forget anything?
I think you covered that very well. So let's take a couple of more questions. Vasilius.
Thanks very much. This is a very nice project. I may be entirely wrong here, but on the basis of your presentation, what I got is that the ability-related task you were talking about was, well, an absolute performance task. And what I would like, well, in addition to that, in a way, what I would like to see also is a contest, essentially. If I had data on the rankings, then for one, I think that the space, may be wrong again, but I think that the space of, well, the set of Nash equilibria would expand massively. And then, you know, all things would happen. But also, if the, if the underrepresented group selects into the ability-related task, and with the contest, they perform better. And that in itself provides a sort of corrective mechanism that can dissipate the sort of bias in a way. Mm-hmm. So again, it's a different sort of data. I think that you were looking at the relative populations that were opting for the ability-related task. If we could have the data on the ranking, the performance, that might itself correct the bias without anything else in a way.
Yeah, so I think, so in the paper, I actually call this a competitive task, because you have this ability or this distribution of abilities, and abilities, I call them directly probabilities of success, which are always in the range of 0, 1. So if you get a draw of your ability that's very close to 1, then in the ranking of the population, you are one of the best ones, and so you're most likely to succeed. So that's why I call it a competitive task. Now, you're completely right that it doesn't have this other aspect that usually appears in like contest competitive task literature, which is the fact that people have or form beliefs about who else is going to apply. And I think this is a different setting than what I am aiming at. So I think if you want, when it's sensible to assume that people form these beliefs, you are in rather small context, because people have to have an idea of who else is out there, have to form a belief about what their possible ability could be, and then would they apply or not. This is more into a context, I don't know, when you apply to a university, for example, there's, at least for Cambridge, I imagine there are many, many applicants, and you have no clue who's out there. And so in a sense, your belief about your probability of success is indirectly also a belief about your ranking between 0 and 1. So that's a bit how it translates. But I completely agree with you that it's not a perfect, it doesn't contain all the aspects of a contest. Now, when you're saying these success rates and the selection effect, it kind of gives this counteracting force that balances everything out. So this is only happening when people look at these within group success rates. If they don't, so if for some reason we cannot observe those who tried but fail, which in certain contexts is not a bad assumption to make. For example, when you apply to a university, you only see in the end those who actually got admitted, but you don't necessarily know who else applied but didn't get through the selection process. So in these kind of settings, the selection effect never undoes or balances out the population effect. If that answers your question.
I think it does. Otherwise, we can take this over the break. Thank you very much for this.